One of my concerns about our community at this point is that we don't know our own history. And if you know our history, and you know the history of other civil rights movements, you know that we have accomplished so much in such a short period of time. I mean, I get impatient too, and I want everything right now. But it's also important, because we have to be in this for the long haul. It's also important for us to look back and see just how far we've come. Another H word, I also come here with a lot of humility. I'm not sure that a few years ago any religious leader of any kind would have been invited to such a conference, and for good reason. You have been treated very badly by the religious institutions of our time, whether they be Jewish or Christian or Muslim or whatever. You know, our wanting you to come back to church, whatever church is for you, is not unlike asking an abused spouse to go back to her husband. I'm very aware of that, and I am deeply humbled that you would want me to speak to you today. I've just written a new book. It comes out in April, called In the Eye of the Storm, and I am so touched that the foreword has been written by Desmond Tutu. And in it, towards the end, I don't know, I mean, he's been speaking about our issues more and more lately, but at the end of this foreword in my book, he just flat out simply asks forgiveness of LGBT people for the way they have been harmed by Christians around the world. It is an astounding thing for someone of his magnitude. I mean, he is a living, breathing saint in my book. So I come here with great humility. And I come here to talk about another H word, heroes. This room is full of heroes. This room represents people of uncommon courage. Although the world is a better place, it's not as good as it ought to be, and I don't need to tell you about that. And there is risk to having a vision of the world as it should be, and then finding the courage to live as if that vision has already begun, that vision is already here. All of our religious traditions tell us that there is risk to be involved when you tell the truth. And you don't have to tell Jews that. That's what happened to all the prophets who said all the things that the powers that be didn't want to hear. And you shouldn't have to tell it to Christians who the person whom we follow paid a terrible price for telling the truth about the way things really are. I tell my clergy that if you aren't getting into some gospel trouble, you're probably not preaching the gospel. Jesus was always getting into trouble. And so at my consecration, as Mark and I strapped on our bulletproof vests, I felt incredibly honored to be in that long line of people who have just done what needs to be done, no matter what the risks. I think we've got something worth dying for here, and it is our dignity. I also think we need help, all of us, from all kinds of people, but I want to speak about the help that I think religious communities can get. We live in a very odd time in which if you introduce yourself as being Christian, now almost everyone I know feels the need then to say, but not that kind of Christian. And that is a really good sign of how we have let the religious right define us as Christian people, at least, if not as just conservative people. And let's face it, 90% of the oppression you and I face as LGBT people come from the Abrahamic faiths of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. It is an awful burden, and there is no reason in the world that LGBT groups should trust us, except that it is also true that religious people have always been on the forefront of great civil rights movements, or at least been a significant part of them. And there are religious people out there of all faiths who get it, who actually see the vision of justice for all that we so believe in. But it's out there, it's in the water, this negative sense. I had just a horrifying experience. I helped found a group in little old Concord, New Hampshire, for LGBT and questioning teens. Teenagers actually up through age 21. And one night I was having a conversation with 5 or 6 of them. Not one of them was from a religious household. But every one of them thought they knew what God thought of them. They all knew the word abomination. Now, these kids couldn't have found the book of Leviticus if their lives had depended on it. But they knew the word abomination, and they all thought they understood that that is precisely what God thought of them. The church, the religious communities of whatever are responsible for that. And I would say the only people that can undo that are religious people. And I think we are coming into a new era in which LGBT groups are learning to partner with those religious groups who can fight that piece of the battle. You may wilt at the quoting of Scripture. It doesn't scare me one bit. And there are a lot of people in the various religious faiths who can take on those ancient texts and teach us that they don't mean what they initially seem to mean. And this is hugely important to our movement. I think maybe even more so than it was in our work on civil rights and on women's rights and so on, because although the scriptures were used to justify slavery, justify the subjugation of women and so on, nowhere was it so explicit as we seem to have it in around this issue in Scripture. It seems to be so plain and so clear. And so we've got to undo that, because it affects even non-religious people. They think they know what God thinks of us. And so I would say it's time for us to partner, and we have to come out as religious people. I had a very interesting experience. I was at the Human Rights Campaign office in Washington, and so they put word out that, our bishop is here, and about 120 employees came down. And I was asking them, I said, how many of you actually belong to a religious community of faith? And about 2/3 of them put their hands up. And then I said, and how many of you who raised your hands have actually told anyone else in this building that you're religious? 3 hands. I think in some ways it's easier to come out as gay than it is come out as religious.